It's one small step for man, one giant leap. So, I guess you want to do it again.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important.
Of course, everyone knew how important this was. Here's a quote from former NASA Administrator James Webb, who, by the way, mysteriously resigned just 1 year before NASA's greatest achievement, the allegedly successful Apollo 11 moon landings. But why was it so important? Well, I think it was pride, pure and simple. Once we set this lofty goal, there was no way we would ever let any unforeseen stumbling blocks to the technology of the day stand in our way. And oh yes, there were stumbling blocks. One big one in particular.
High above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo.
And if you think NASA had these radiation belts and all the potential risks they pose figured out back in 1969, think again.
In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever. Hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes.
Astronaut James A. Pawelczyk, who served as a payload specialist aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia on the STS-90 mission dubbed Neuralab in 1998 and only achieved an altitude 650 miles below the start of the belts, said, quote, "It never seemed to get completely dark because when we were lying there trying to go to sleep, radiation would hit the rods and cones in our retinas and make bright little flashes. We would say, well, there goes a colored one." So, there we have one astronaut's memory of the effects of cosmic rays. It never seemed completely dark. He says they would be disturbed by the flashes while trying to go to sleep. In other words, he didn't have to pay attention or try to observe these strange occurrences. They would just happen. And remember, he was in Earth orbit, well below the most intense areas of cosmic ray activity. Now it's important to remember here that in order to get to the moon, the Apollo flights flew right through the entirety of these radiation belts. Each of the 21 men to do so spent over an hour inside them. So, what does one of the Apollo astronauts, Alan Bean of Apollo 12, have to say about the effects of the Van Allen belts? Surely he must vividly remember some sort of phenomenon.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No. Now, I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
We didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it inside. And we didn't get any, added radiation.
No strange occurrences?
Nothing like that.
When pressed a little and informed of the 1998 Space Shuttle story, Alan's memory got a little better.
If you're out in space beyond the Van Allen belt, and probably within the Van Allen belt, and close your eyes and just pay attention. You don't notice it unless you pay attention. Then all of a sudden you'll see a little flash like a shooting star, except it's like that. There goes one this way. Then one just blossoms. And then not that fast. Maybe you wait 3 minutes or 2 minutes and one goes whoosh. And what's happening is cosmic rays are hitting the back of your eye and exciting those sensors in the back of your eye. So that's. But see, if you're just going to sleep or closing your eyes or it's dark, you don't notice them. But if you'll close your eyes and pay attention, which we had an experiment to do, by the way, then you see them whistling by. Not on our mission, by the way, they hadn't been discovered yet. I saw them one day on the moon. It wasn't dark, and it was kind of dark, and I saw this flash of light, and it looked like it was on the moon, but really it wasn't. It was a flash of light in my.
Ay caramba. What an utter load of nonsense. Anyway, in summing up about the Van Allen radiation belts, I think they did pose significant threats to manned missions to the moon back in 1969, and to this day. In 1969 they were newly discovered and not that well understood. NASA is still learning new, surprising things about their effects today. They may well have sent some unnamed astronauts to the moon in a secret surrogate program. Perhaps successful, perhaps not. Perhaps we'll never know for sure, but one thing's for sure. And that's that there are some glaring inconsistencies and serious issues with the official Apollo record. Let's delve into that now, shall we? Now, we all know the Earth is round, right? A heavenly spherical blue ball in space. We all learned this in grade school. The Earth is round. Then could you please tell me what in the heck this misshapen, deformed, more oblong than round, weird thing is? This is unedited footage taken by the crew of Apollo 11 inside of their spacecraft. There's over 40 minutes of this video that NASA sent by mistake to fellow Apollo researchers. Only 20 seconds or so of this video ever aired on television. This shot was, of course, never used. As you'll hear in a minute, they claim to be 130,000 miles away from Earth on their way to the moon. This is allegedly a view outside one of their spacecraft's windows of Earth in the distance.
Okay, 11, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over. Hi, Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out. And we'll zoom our camera in slowly to get the most magnification we can. Over. Roger.
Here they've obviously fixed whatever was causing the misshapen appearance. They also claim that they have the window completely filled up with the TV camera. Now this is very important to remember. I cannot stress this point enough. According to them, the entire window is filled with the camera.
Unfortunately, we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera. So your view now is probably better than ours is. Roger, we copy.
How then, my dear friends, do you explain this? This sure did surprise me. As the camera slowly drifts away from the Earth, we see what appears to be the wall of the inside of the spacecraft, not the smooth, even blackness of space, as you might expect if the window was truly filled with the camera. And look at that bright blue light. Why would the Earth be shining through that window so brightly if it was truly 130,000 miles away? We'll come back to that in a minute. Here's another shot of the camera slowly panning away and the wall of the inside of the spacecraft becoming visible again. And now here's a real doozy. And remember, they've stated that they have the window completely filled up with the camera. Remember, that is the critical point here. Now, as you'll see, an astronaut's body or arm clearly comes into view between the Earth and the camera, obstructing the shot.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow. We can see...
Let's look at that again. Obviously, what they were trying to pass off as the darkness of space was simply the inside of their spacecraft. Why would they need to fake a shot of being halfway to the moon, unless they couldn't even go halfway to the moon? And it definitely appears that they are faking. Look at this. This is a sequence from the same unauthorized film as they adjust the camera for an interior scene. The camera's true position becomes apparent, and we see a diffused floodlight overhead used to see camera controls. It seems that what they've done here is either one of two things. Either that entire window was filled up with the Earth as they were in Earth orbit, which was then filmed from the other side of their darkened spacecraft, while using some sort of contraption placed in one side of the window in order to simulate the Earth's terminator line, which separates night from day, and to fix the misshapen problem seen earlier. It sure looks like that's what they're fooling with right here. Did you catch that? Here it is again. Top right-hand corner. There it is. What in the heck are they doing there? Looks fishy to me. The other likely scenario is that they taped a color transparency of the Earth to that window, which was then illuminated by incoming sunlight as they were in Earth orbit. Which it looks very much like is the case in this particular shot, as the camera's iris is now opened, and we see what looks very much like just such a transparency right here.
Is Buzz holding your cue cards for you, over? Cue cards have a no. We have no intention of competing with the professionals, believe me.
Yeah, maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea. But wait, there's more. As the scene continues, the cameraman pans over to the left a little and, lo and behold, what do we see? That sure looks like the Earth to me. Now ask yourself, just how in God's name can the Earth be visible in this opposite window, if it was truly visible from 130,000 miles away, out of the other window? It simply could not. When you put all this together, the misshapen Earth, the astronauts coming between the Earth and the camera, after they've claimed the camera was filling the window, the fooling around with some sort of insert in the window, and now this, you arrive at no other conclusion. They obviously were faking this shot in order to make it appear as though they were halfway to the moon. Ask yourself, why would they do such a thing? Oh yeah, there's one other really interesting thing about this piece of footage. At least twice Neil Armstrong is clearly heard being prompted to talk by some mysterious third party, not Houston, not one of the Apollo 11 crew. Here Houston initiates communication. There is no reply for several seconds. Then the third party says, "Talk," and Armstrong immediately starts talking.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger, we're mapping in on Earth.
Here, Houston again initiates communication, and then the transmission cuts out. The third party's voice is mumbled this time, and it's hard to make out exactly what it says, but again, immediately after we hear the same voice, Armstrong starts talking.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that TV looks really great. Bye-bye. Okay, you just cut out, Charlie. We understand that it's looking great. We'll leave it the way it is and wait for you to come back.
And remember, this film was released by mistake, or perhaps by a whistleblower. And again, it is slated and dated July 18th, 1969, and in my opinion therefore proves that, at the very least, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin never walked on the moon, because they are clearly seen in this film in low Earth orbit on the very days their mission was said to be approaching and landing on the moon. If they truly were in low Earth orbit on these dates, as this film clearly shows, then it's simply an impossibility. But if that's not enough for you, don't worry, there's more. let's delve into some of the photography allegedly taken on the surface of the moon, shall we? At left we have a photo newly released as of July 2004, compared to a previously released photo at right. These are allegedly consecutive photos taken on the same roll by Armstrong of Aldrin exiting the hatch of the LEM. There are numerous anomalies apparent, the most obvious of which is this bright piece of metal present at left but not at right. What other anomalies are obvious to you? Let's zoom in on both photos, here and here. What we find is that while the photos are from very similar points of view, reflected in the window in one is blackness, and in the other one, bright blue, with a black horizon line. But shouldn't the reflections match? And let's take a closer look at the US decal in both photos. It seems a tad distorted in one or the other. On the right the font type is more expanded, even though at a sharper oblique angle. And oddly enough it can be made to match by computer stretching. Now, let's take a closer look here and here. On the left it seems we have a tiny man and large door, and on the right we have the opposite, a large man and tiny door. And what about the lighting? The bright lighting inside the LEM, seen here, is truly incredible since it is alleged to be reflected from the lunar surface. The shadow on the backpack indicates some lighting is coming down from above. Impossible if the light is reflected from the moon's surface. Remember, the sun is at the opposite side of the LEM, and no direct sunlight falls on the scene. Here's a photo, 4 shots later on the same roll. Let's look again at the hatch door area of the LEM. An experienced photographer might detect here what appears to be a cross shadow from studio fill lighting. These yellow lines should illustrate exactly what we're talking about. An apologist might retort that the egress door was painted in 2 tones of gray. This would be quite odd because on these missions everything was done for a reason. Looks were not a feature of the ugly LEM design, and isn't it a coincidence that the shadow on the ceiling falls exactly at the top of the color change? As we investigate further we find that, yes, many other Apollo 11 LEM photos show the same 2-tone door, like this one. But in another astonishing coincidence, all of these also show the same cross-lighting shadow across the ceiling, joining to the top of the door at the same point. And here's another example from Apollo 11. The red lines show the same cross shadow. But if by chance this 2-tone gray door feature was somehow the standard paint job for the LEMs, I wonder why they decided to switch sides. The Apollo 11 photos clearly show the darker side as the left-hand side, but this detail enhanced from a very dark Apollo 12 photo shows the dark tone on the right-hand side. A search of Apollo 14 photographs for any with a clear view of the LEM hatch door revealed only this one, which is infamous in its own right. How can the LEM be so well lit with the sun behind it? Anyway, let's look closer at the door. As you can see, it is not painted in 2 tones. So, according to the Apollo apologists, then I guess, on 11 they painted it in 2 tones of gray, with the darker shade on the left. Then on 12 they painted it in 2 tones, with the darker shade on the right. And then for 14 they decided to scrap the whole 2-tone scheme altogether. But this photo does have 2 improbable features. An optical, rainbow, prismatic reflection of unknown cause, and a fake, yes, fake crosshair. NASA claims the crosshairs seen on all the Apollo photographs were literally ingrained into the picture as they were snapped. But note the shadow. This is an impossible occurrence while using such a method. What about Apollo 15? Although they took 1,021 pictures, they apparently did not take one single photo of the front of the LEM. We have to wonder, why not? Apollo 15 was the first mission to take the lunar rover, but no photos exist of it being unloaded or equipped. Again, why not? Here's one of the front of the LEM from Apollo 16. Pretty unremarkable. No 2-tone door, no shadow from cross-lighting, and no rainbow. But let's compare this with one taken of the same LEM on the same mission, but while in orbit. The Apollo 16 LEM underwent some truly remarkable changes. The US decals are in different locations, centered while in orbit, off-centered on the surface, and it changes from being on top of a gold foil to underneath, in orbit. The area we've marked with the A is allegedly the area containing the folded-up lunar rover. But on the surface this area is still covered in foil. And here, the undisturbed soil shows that the rover was not unloaded in that vicinity. And now Apollo 17. At first glance the door may appear to be a single tone of gray, but as we zoom in and enhance the brightness slightly, we see what appears to be a faint diagonal shadow, different from those on Apollo 11. And this makes sense because lighting the multi-surfaced lab must have been a photographer's nightmare. By 17 they made a couple big improvements. Compare this photograph with one from Apollo 11. On 17 they finally got the surface lighting done correctly on these marked areas. In the Apollo 11 photo, Area A should be the same dark gray as Area B. This was the result of bad lighting. And now, on to some photos of Buzz Aldrin. This is probably the most widely reproduced Apollo image, and it is plagued by two big anomalies. A false color version shows fall-off area and uneven surface lighting indicating studio fill lighting was used, and there's this.
The position of the horizon cutting through the image of the astronaut shows us the level of the camera when the picture was taken. And if we look at the picture, we can see the horizon cuts very nicely at face level.
And as for the orientation of where the astronaut was, I mean, the moon's surface isn't completely flat. He may well be standing there with with his camera at chest level, and the guy being photographed maybe a couple of feet lower down because the ground slopes.
The camera taking the photograph could have been positioned on the chest of an astronaut, and that astronaut could have been about 2 foot higher than the astronaut that was being photographed. To this end, we could analyze the shadow in the image. Basically, the information we have and can make use of is we know the width of the visor in the image, the focal length of the lens used on the camera. Using that information, we can analyze the shadow of the astronaut's left leg and determine between the two astronauts the variation in height of the surface. The variation in height of the surface between the astronauts is typically a few inches. It would have to actually be 2 feet to explain the incorrect positioning of the camera when the image was taken.
Now remember how we talked earlier about the crosshairs that are on all the Apollo photographs? This becomes very relevant here.
On all the NASA still photographs taken by the Hasselblad lunar surface camera, one should see small crosses spread at intervals over the surface of the image. In the center of the image, there should be a larger crosshair, or reticle as it's called professionally. These reticles were virtually in contact with the film and set in the focal plane of the camera at the time of manufacture by Zeiss. This means they are removable. Any photograph purporting to be taken on the moon by the named Apollo astronauts using these lunar surface cameras must feature the large reticle at the center of the picture. We're surprised to find that this reticle is over the lower part of Aldrin's right leg. The Hasselblad camera was attached to the astronaut's chest at the time, and so the center of the image should be over the abdominal area of the subject. This lower leg position for the center reticle strongly indicates that the camera was in fact positioned at a higher level. As this graphic demonstrates, the center of the picture can only be over the subject's lower leg if the camera is positioned at eye level and then tilted down. The camera height and tilt angle was calculated by David Groves. This fact represents another serious problem. The reflection of this scene mirrored in the astronaut's visor shows the astrophotographer with his camera clearly positioned at chest level, which actually cannot be. So this false reflection must have been composited or painted in over the original image. The reflection we see in the visor cannot be that of the photographer of the image.
The most compelling piece of evidence in this photograph is not the measurements of the height of the camera, but the reticles, the little crosses that are superimposed on the image at the time the photograph is taken. The largest reticle appears at the center. That central position is fixed in the camera. It cannot move. You have to have, with an image, it hasn't been interfered with in any way, that reticule appearing in the center of the image. If we look at this famous photograph, we can see the central reticule towards the bottom of the astronaut's right leg. This is significantly offset from the center of the image. This cannot occur in that position unless the photograph has been copied and reframed.
Now let's return for a second to the evidence of fill lighting. Let's ask the guy who helped design the camera used to take these pictures, a man who does not doubt their authenticity, nor the authenticity of the Apollo program, if it looks like Aldrin is standing in a spotlight.
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you have to find Armstrong and ask him.
Well, fellow Apollo researcher Bart Sibrel tracked Armstrong down and tried to get some answers out of him concerning the numerous problems with the Apollo record, but guess what?
Mr. Sibrel, you do not deserve answers.
Well, that's certainly interesting, isn't it? I believe anyone who raises any serious questions about such a historical event does deserve answers. And luckily, I think the photographs themselves give us plenty. Let's get back into it. Let's take a closer look at some details of Buzz's suit. Although in all 6 the lighting is reasonably the same, in numbers 1 and 4, he has white gloves, while in all the rest he has dark gray gloves. In 1 and 6 he has an antenna, but no antenna in the others. In numbers 1 through 3 as well as 5 and 6, he clearly has high boots, but in number 4, no high boots. All 6 of these photos are from the same roll. Not necessarily a smoking gun, but pretty interesting, I would say. Now, let's take a closer look at 2 of these photos. On the left we have a crop of the Buzz Aldrin classic photo seen earlier, and on the right we have a shot of Buzz in the exact same area. He's simply turned around for this pose, and Neil has walked around to the other side. The ground is relatively flat in this area. Judging from the spot, he is standing in the same place. So why are the 2 poses so different? On the left he has short legs and long arms. On the right he has the opposite, long legs and short arms. And what's more, notice the strong top view of the backpack on the right. While yes, it does appear that he may be leaning forward slightly in this pose, is it really enough of a lean to yield such a view of the top of the backpack from a chest-mounted camera on flat ground? Now let's compare this photo to the one snapped right before you. These are consecutive photos on the same roll. At left, he stands with his knees bent as he plants the solar wind flag. At right, his knees are not bent, and he has not stepped far back or into a hole, yet he is considerably shorter. Note the line which shows the tops of his boots almost aligned, and then check his helmet with the height of the flag. If you think this might be due to the forward lean, and think that if he were standing straight up, the heights would match, remember that in the other photo his knees are bent, making the anomaly in height that much larger. Now, let's look at some images from Apollo 12. This is clearly impossible. These 2 consecutive cropped photos show an identical line of sight. The camera does not move. The only way this would be possible would be to use a tripod. But this is allegedly Pete Conrad photographing Alan Bean as he descends the ladder. And he's using a chest-mounted camera with big, bulky, pressurized gloves in a rather hostile, alien environment. And most importantly, he is on unfamiliar footing. How could he maintain such an astonishingly identical line of sight? Here's a photo of the Surveyor 2, an unmanned probe NASA sent to the moon in 1966. It's kind of hard to make out. Here it is, right here. Notice the distant limb in the upper left-hand corner. Now take a look at this photo of one of the astromen at the same Surveyor probe. Obviously we are now much closer to the surveyor, but again notice the LEM in the distance. This cannot be. The LEMs are virtually identical in these two photos, yet the lines of sight are at almost right angles to each other. The pink lines connect the LEM with the surveyor in each photo, therefore the photo at left must have been shot in the area of the green square. Given the big differences in distance, the LEM cannot remain the same size. Yet it clearly does. One of these photos cannot be authentic. Now let's compare two more shots of the surveyor probe. This one, which is shot from a distance, and this one, which is again from much closer. These views certainly appear to be mutually exclusive. So, moving about 50 feet closer to the surveyor should increase the size of the LEM on the horizon. But, again, as you can see, it stays the same size. Truly phenomenal. Remember our old friend the crosshairs, or reticules? Well, check this out. The file numbers are different, but these two photos are identical, except for the cropping and the placement of the crosshairs. The cropping of the photo on the right appears as cropped by NASA. They must have copied this photo from a negative that lacked crosshairs and then superimposed them in a separate double exposure, but mistakenly did not get them in the same place. But according to NASA, no Apollo surface photo should ever be lacking crosshairs, because remember, they claim the crosshairs were set in the images, inside the camera, at the time of exposure. Something fishy is going on here. As well as here. These are two consecutive photographs taken by the same chest-mounted camera, and the point of view is identical, but the crosshairs are not. Check the locations of all the rocks, they are identical. This is impossible. Since the point of view is identical, the crosshairs must be identical. But they are clearly not. Here's a shot of the commander of the Apollo 12 mission, Pete Conrad. Note the landing site and the LEM in the distance, beyond the large crater. There are no footprints leading from there to here, but 7 footprints underneath Conrad. How did he get here? Was he lowered into place where he proceeded to do a funky little dance? Maybe there are footprints just out of view. But look carefully, there are no prints leading from where his feet are now to the edge of view, in any direction. Pretty odd. Houston, we have a problem. Apollo 13. Actually, there are two problems, two big problems, with this mission, other than the alleged explosion of an oxygen tank that forced NASA to abort. An explosion, by the way, which many experts believe would have thrown the spacecraft irrevocably off course. Never mind that. And never mind the fact that the American public was fast losing interest in the space program by the time of Apollo 13. Many people actually called the networks to complain that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted during the Apollo 12 moonwalk. And, yes, even never mind the truly astonishing fact that the alleged Apollo 13 accident happened on the 13th day, in the 13th hour, and 13th minute, Houston time. Never mind all that. The two biggest problems are as follows.
When the astronauts have transferred to the LEM, some 200,000 miles from Earth, we look out of the small observation window and see the colour blue, not the black of space that NASA's astronauts describe. The official NASA footage has the LEM's triangular windows entirely filled with a blue as bright as that of a cloudless summer's day here on Earth. It's astonishing. If these astronauts really were some 200,000 miles away from Earth, surely the windows of the LEM should be entirely filled with the black of deep space.
And, perhaps more importantly,
Fra Mauro is situated in the southwestern quadrant of the Moon, and what is of significance in relationship to this site is the position of the terminator, the line that marks the limit of the sunlit portion of the Moon. To be able to land on the Moon successfully, the LEM pilots needed to be able to see where they were going, and NASA has always emphasized that all landing sites and times were selected with this requirement in mind. But at the time of the Apollo 13 accident, their Fra Mauro landing site was in complete darkness, And, most significantly, it was to remain in darkness until long after the astronauts had left lunar orbit. And this fact can be checked with the help of a little rudimentary knowledge of astronomy and an ephemeris. But if you aren't mathematically inclined, don't worry, because the maths have been done and the results check out. It's also been confirmed by Andrew Chaikin, space historian and author of A Man on the Moon, which was written with the compliance of NASA, that concerning Apollo 13, Chaikin states, by Wednesday, April 15th, 2.5 days after the accident, the Apollo 13 combo had circumnavigated the Moon, corrected its trajectory, and was already 19,000 miles into its homeward journey. The Moon, still close enough to see craters with the unaided eye, and Fred Hayes, alone in Aquarius, was looking at it. And Chaikin tells us what Hayes saw, or rather, what he didn't see. Near the terminator, just emerging from night, he could barely make out the highland region of Fra Mauro. So there you have it. The Fra Mauro site was in darkness on the date scheduled for the landing of this lunar expedition. Whatever might be the truth concerning the exact whereabouts of Apollo 13, the Sun and the Moon do not alter their dance through space.
Indeed, they do not. And so, I think it's rather obvious that the Apollo 13 accident and dramatic safe return of the crew was a staged ploy to regenerate interest in the space program and suck a few more $1 billion pure profit out of the duped taxpayers, but moreover, to serve as a rather good excuse to eventually cancel the Apollo program and to limit future manned exploration of space. NASA never intended Apollo 13 to land on the Moon, nor any of the other named missions. Now, let's look at Apollo 14. Here we have one of the more obvious examples of fakery. This photo simply could not have been taken on the Moon. On the Moon with no atmosphere and in natural sunlight, all shadows should be parallel. In other words, they should all point in the exact same direction. They would never diverge, as is seen here. Again, shadows from a faraway source, like the Sun, would be parallel. The next time you are out for a drive on a clear sunny day, look around and take notice of all the shadows. You'll find that they all go off in the same direction. But not these babies. Apollo believers will claim that the divergence in shadow direction is due to elevation differences. But look carefully. Notice that the shadows of all the small rocks on the left of frame also extend in the same direction, not just those in the right foreground. Clearly, the slight rise in the right foreground is not the reason for the direction of the shadow divergence. Look at it again, uncropped and without the yellow lines. It's obvious. The shadows in the foreground, regardless of ground elevation, point southeast. As they get closer and closer to the background and the LEM, we see that the shadows gradually change direction and point due east. This can only occur under a nearby artificial light source. Here the light source is just off stage to the left. And now, another shadow anomaly. As a representation of the astronaut's legs and body, the matchstick or skinny shadow seen here is both inadequate and inaccurate. And we see more evidence of the use of studio fill lighting. The light on the side of the body nearest the camera and furthest away from the Sun, which is out of frame to the left, is far too bright. Here in this computer-adjusted version, we see how this photograph should look if it indeed was taken on the Moon under the light of the faraway Sun, with no fill lighting. It's important to note here that NASA never sent any artificial fill lighting on any of these missions. NASA and the Apollo believers claim that any evidence of the use of fill lighting is actually due to reflected sunlight bouncing off the Moon's surface. But the Moon's surface only has a reflectivity rate of about 7%, which is about the same as asphalt. And it's not even enough to light up the shadow side of the smallest rocks, as seen here. Some might claim that this is due to the rocks being too close to the ground. So let's take another look at this incredible photograph from Apollo 14. How is it possible, with a camera pointing directly into the Sun, to have the silhouetted side of the subject, in this case the LEM, come out so perfectly exposed? The side of the LEM we see here should be as dark as the shadow. But it's not. And what's this? A very small, close to the ground object that's lit up like a Christmas tree. I do believe this bright reflection seen here is the reflection of the artificial studio fill lighting used to light the shadowed side of the LEM. Additionally, a circular halo, as seen here, is not a true photographic result of pointing a camera directly at the sun. The anomalies abound and astound, but anyway. Moving right along, let's look at a few photographs from Apollo 15. Here's the Apollo 15 LEM. Besides the masking tape apparently holding the thing together, do you notice anything odd in the picture? Let's take a closer look down here, in the lower right. Here's a cleaner close-up. It looks like 3-color, 8x10 photographs scattered on the landing pad. What in the world is going on here? The one on the right seems to be a man in an astronaut suit without the helmet, standing by a dark object with a red light. The one on the left is far more interesting, although a tad blurry when enlarged. It seems to show a scene clearly recognizable as a photograph from the Apollo 11 mission, when flipped horizontally, shown here at right. Both images show the LEM, the flag, the experiment package, and the astronaut. These shapes are far too alike to be mere coincidence. There isn't any record that the Apollo 15 mission took 8x10 photographs of Apollo 11 to the moon with them. Why would they need them? Why would they place them on the landing pad for this photo? This is truly weird. Maybe you should contact NASA and ask them why there are 8x10 photographs, possibly of Apollo 11, on the landing pad of the LEM in an Apollo 15 photo. The NASA file number of this photo is AS15-87-11839. Here's another good one from Apollo 15. This is the lunar rover, of course, but how did it get here? Note the footprints, clearly visible, but look, there's no wheel tracks, not a one. Pretty wild. No, not that kind of wild. Now, let's move on to some photographs from Apollo 16. Here's the Apollo 16 LEM. In orbit, at top, compared to on the surface, at bottom. We talked earlier about how this particular LEM underwent some truly drastic changes from in orbit to on surface, but now let's delve a little deeper into it. There are two stowage areas marked S and R. R1 is where the lunar rover was allegedly stowed, without any foil wrapping, mind you, but look at the surface photo. R2 clearly shows something in the same area covered in foil. The surface photo was taken after the lunar rover was unloaded and assembled. The yellow line next to T2 shows how thick the rover would have to have been in order to actually be stowed there while in orbit, only about 18 inches. This is laughable. The yellow arrows in R1 and the inset picture of a folded up rover at bottom show the actual thickness, about 40 inches. Plus, the bottom of the rover was a bright aluminum and would reflect light. It would not appear black, as this R1 area clearly does. There's no way the rover could have been stowed in this area. This stowage problem could explain why no still photographs were taken of the LEM before unloading the rover. In fact, there were no still photographs taken of any Apollo LEM on the lunar surface prior to unloading the rover. And no photos of any astronauts unloading or assembling the rover. Now, something else just as ridiculous. S1 shows the American flag on a dark wall behind foil and a United States decal on top of the foil, but look at S2. The decals have moved to the right, and the foil has been removed, but look, the United States decal is now on the wall behind where the foil was. How can this be, when in orbit it was clearly on top of this foil? These decals cannot move to the right together like this. These images have clearly been doctored. And what about this? H shows a lanyard used to open the stowage bay, and which should only be visible in this position when the bay is open, but it is clearly seen in the orbit photo. How can this be? They would not have the stowage bay open while in orbit. One more thing. There is one identical highlight, seen in both photos, in identical positions. One is on the alleged rover, and one is on the foil, but it is the same highlight. This convinces me that these two photos, one allegedly in lunar orbit and one allegedly on the lunar surface, were actually taken during the exact same photo shoot, and wherever it wasn't anywhere near the moon. And finally, Apollo 17. Here's a couple of images from this last Apollo mission. On top we have a big mountain and small limb, and on the bottom a small mountain and big limb. But look at the rock in between, right here. This rock, seen in both photos, is identical, and astonishingly enough, remains the same size. The other rocks and shapes on the ground around the rock in both photos match up, so it definitely seems as though this is indeed the same rock. But how in the world could this be? It's obviously a different mountain in the background in each photo. Mountains on the moon aren't that easy to just pick up and move around, but guess what? Studio backdrops on Earth sure are. It's either that, or these photos were airbrushed and doctored to have different backgrounds. In either case, NASA is lying. Maybe this one rock was left in on purpose by a whistleblower at NASA who was unhappy with the treacherous lie that NASA was perpetrating on the American people. Now, check this one out. Here we have two consecutive Apollo 17 photos taken from on board the lunar rover. That's the TV camera that was mounted on the front of the rovers. I repeat, these are consecutive images. No significant time passed from one to the next, so a change in the position of the sun cannot account for the anomalies. Notice how the rocks are lighted differently. The lighting changes about 180 degrees from one snapshot to the next. And notice how the shadow of the dish antenna on the left gets smaller and changes position. And what about this? Here's the Apollo 17 rover in its final resting place. But again, how did it get here? If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that the soil was soft enough to leave footprints, but where are the wheel tracks? It just gets lunier and lunier. Notice anything wrong with this one? Well, here's something. The shadows go in all sorts of different directions. Remember, under a natural, faraway light source, like the sun, all shadows should go in the same direction, regardless of ground elevation. This is an example of some truly confused lighting. And to finish off our photo analysis, we have this little gem. At left we see that some sort of black patch has been added to the limb, which overlaps the corner of the flag decal. The adjusted version on bottom makes this patch more visible. This black paper-like patch thing was not a part of the limb. No other photos of the flag decal show this black patch. It must have been added on the set during the photo shoot. The astronauts certainly had no reason whatsoever to add it, nor had they the material to add it while on the moon. On the right we see a very odd reflection that appears on the surface of the helmet visor. There is nothing in the scene behind the guy taking the photo that would reflect in the visor like this. Not a dish, not an experiment, nothing. Maybe the NASA press office has the answer to what this strange reflection might be. And now, before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at some of the video allegedly shot on the lunar surface from some of the Apollo missions. In order to make it look as though the astronauts were in lunar gravity and not in Earth's stronger gravity, which is where they really were, NASA used two relatively ingenious methods. They recorded the video in slow motion, and at least in some cases they had the astronauts rigged up to some sort of wire support system. On several occasions light can be seen bouncing off these wires in momentary glints or pings. As we run this clip from Apollo 14 a few times, keep a watch above the astronaut's head. Here's another example of a wire ping. This one's from Apollo 17. Watch the upper portion of the frame, above the astronaut on the right. Tell me that doesn't look like a wire. and there's more evidence of the use of wires. In this Apollo 16 footage, there is clear evidence of a floating or slightly dangling effect. It's as if the weight is being taken off the astronaut's feet just a second or so too soon. Compare that with this Apollo rehearsal footage. The dangling effect is very evident. And then, there is this.
Give me a hand. Okay, here we go.
Let me give you a hand, he says.
There goes Barry. There goes another man. Barry. Coming.
Look at it again. The astronaut is getting up with the wire taking the weight.
And then there's what just may be my favorite type of Apollo footage. This astronaut, from Apollo 15, is fixing to take a trip and fall down. And no, it's not my favorite kind, because I'm some mean jerk or something. I'll explain why it's my favorite in a second. Let's watch.
And we haven't seen to the bottom. I think we'll get a chance to look further down. Hey.
Truly astonishing. What if there had been a sharp rock off screen to the left there, and this guy had fallen over on his back, right into the sharp rock? The backpacks housed the essential life support system that allowed these human beings to function in the vacuum of space, which is the Moon environment.
Oh, dadgummit.
Jack Schmidt having a few problems.
I mean, look at this, it's incredible. There's all kinds of footage like this of these guys falling down, or if not actually falling, carrying on in such careless ways that you expect them to fall at any second. Let me ask you a question. If you were out in such a deadly and dangerous environment, such as the surface of the Moon in the vacuum of space, and you were in such a delicate, intricate, and sensitive device, which housed vital equipment that your life depended on, such as these space suits, would you be carrying on in such a carefree fashion? I don't think I would. Video of astronauts acting like this is actually what first led me to suspect that the whole thing was a giant hoax. And after much research, I definitely do think that the whole thing was a giant hoax. There's just too many questions about the level of the technology at the time, and way too many unexplained anomalies in the official record. Hopefully this film has provoked you to question the official record and to question something which you've most likely always just assumed to be true. Maybe now you'll want to use this information and gather additional information. There's plenty more out there to provoke others to question something that they've never questioned before, but just always knew to be true. But I'm afraid it may be a losing battle because
all of this attempt to say the Apollo programs were fake is just sheer nonsense, and you can talk till hell freezes over and you're wrong.
This is 30-year-old stuff. We mounted this expedition, the expeditions to the Moon, almost 30 years ago. And frankly, I don't understand why we should spend the time to go off and do the research to look up, to prove to people that we went to the Moon. The fact of the matter is we did go to.
And sadly, there are millions of people out there who agree. Their minds are completely closed off, and for them, the official record need not be validated, and the fact that we went to the Moon need not be proven. And to me, that's just